Welcome to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We provide fiction reviews for the lit curious reader because why not try a little bit of everything? Our scholarish approach and cozy book club atmosphere makes literature accessible to everyone, whether you're a casual reader or a devoted bookworm. Join us on our literary journey to explore all genres. Hello, and welcome back to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. I'm Jennifer, and today Joey and I will be having an affair with one of my favorite contemporary authors, Margaret Atwood, and her short story, Happy Endings. Before we dive into the story, let's take just a few moments to explore a very brief biography of Margaret Atwood and why her work might be especially relevant today. She was born in November 1939 in Ottawa, Canada, so she has been around for a while. She is a distinguished and prolific author known for her contributions to literature across various genres. She is celebrated not only for her novels, but also for her poetry, short stories, essays, and literary criticism. Her works often explore themes of feminism, environmentalism, and dystopian societies, my personal favorite, and her sharp wit and keen insight has resonated deeply with readers around the world for decades. Margaret Atwood's career is marked by her unwavering commitment to exploring complex themes. Her works often explore power dynamics, environmental issues, and the human condition. With a strong feminist perspective, she is always challenging societal norms. Her works not only entertain, but also provide critical thought and inspire change, making her one of the most influential authors of our time. Now, you may be thinking, Margaret Atwood, I think I've heard of her before. You may know her from her novels such as The Handmaid's Tale, which came out in 1985, Alias Grace in 1996, or The Year of the Flood from 2009. Or maybe you're a bit more familiar with her recent endeavor, which is the long-awaited sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, titled The Testaments, which came out in 2019. If this is your first experience with Margaret Atwood, you're in for such a treat. Beyond her novels, Atwood's essays and criticism reflect her engagement with contemporary issues. Her accolades include the Booker Prize and the Arthur C. Clarke Award. Her recent works affirm her enduring relevance, securing her legacy as a literary icon whose voice continues to inspire and provoke thought. There's so much to say about Margaret Atwood that I would love to revisit her at another time on an Extra Literary Affairs episode. She is still alive, she is still producing, and we are still so lucky that she is constantly poking the hornet's nest. So, Joey, anything you'd like to add before we jump into the summary of Happy Endings?
Oh, I knew that she won the Booker Prize. She actually won it at the same time. There was two winners that year, and she won it with Bernadette Evaristo. And we read her book, Girl, Woman, Other. That was the other winner that year, the same one. She won for The
Wow.
Testaments, and then Bernadette Evaristo won for Girl, Woman, Other. I mean, I had already heard that book. I do actually own The Testaments. I've just never read it. But I
Joey,
don't have anything else to add about Margaret Atwood. I do want to explore more about her life. From what I do know about her, she was an activist, and I think it'd be really interesting because you love The Year of the Flood, which is actually the second book in the Orcs and Crake, the series, which is a trilogy, which
the
I have not
Mad
read.
Adam
Oh,
trilogy.
Mad Adam. There you go. And that's the last book. I haven't read Mad Adam yet. I do have it. Wow. Adding all these other books that I just need to read. Yeah, it would be fun to learn more about her life and then see how this all comes out in her work.
Great, Joey. So let's move on to the summary of today's story, Happy Endings. Happy Endings is a brilliant and thought-provoking metafictional short story that explores the complexities of life and the often elusive nature of the happy ending. Structured in an unconventional format, Atwood presents 6 different scenarios that all begin with the same characters, John and Mary, and all conclude with the same basic ending. John and Mary die. Very stark, very direct. Each scenario varies in the events and circumstances leading up to their inevitable demise, illustrating the diverse path that life can take. The story opens with a scenario A depicting a very stereotypical and idealistic life where John and Mary fall in love, marry, very interesting play on words there, and live happily ever after. However, Atwood is Atwood. So she swiftly transitions to scenarios B through E, each revealing a more realistic and sometimes bleak perspective by delving into themes of illness, struggle, infidelity. And then she turns to scenario F, which returns to a basic storyline, which questions the meaning of a happy ending at all. Through Happy Endings, Atwood challenges readers to reflect on the nature of storytelling and the pursuit of happiness. She suggests that the minutiae of life, the struggles, triumphs, and failures, are what truly define our existence rather than the simplistic notion of a quote, happy ending, unquote. This story serves as a poignant reminder to appreciate the journey and the depth of human experience. So, Joey, I am dying to hear what your initial impressions of this story were.
I like this story. I'm not surprised. I like Margaret Atwood's writing. I was thinking when I first saw the way that it was set up without reading it, I thought it was a pick your own adventure story, which it sort of is. You can skip A if you want to in the very beginning. She tells you if you want a happy ending, try A. So if you want to be like, no, I don't want that. It could be sort of pick your own adventure and it kind of alludes to that style. But I had never heard of this story, so I was looking it up. And it's actually one of her most well-known and well studied. There's a lot of scholarship around this story because of the structure of it. So I think that's where the merit of this story lies. I think there are a lot of topics that she's touching on, but it doesn't feel like a Margaret Atwood story to me because there's so much obviously missing, and that's intentional. She wasn't like, I just don't feel like writing a whole story today. She obviously went in this with intention. So I would say that if you really like reading stories about stories and you like reading about the structure of narratives and how stories should function or how they function, then I think this is an excellent story and it's super quick. It's only 3 pages. There's not a lot of word. It's a very economical story. But what little she does give us, there is a lot of emotion that's tied up in this. Whoever side you're taking or whatever character you're most curious what will happen to them. I think you were talking about Mary and saying like, oh no, you know what? We can get to the names of why I think she did Mary and Madge. I'll end it there and say that overall, yes, I really enjoyed it. I would like to read more of her short stories because I haven't read that many of hers.
Excellent, Joey. So I also had never heard of this short story. I'm more familiar with her novels. As soon as I started the story, I was like, I am going to love this. And one of the things I loved about it, it's like, what are you doing? Are you telling me to write my own story? Really? Like, you're just giving me the blueprint and you're like, oh, and I'm going to just read the opening paragraph because I thought it was just so scene setting, as we often talk about.
Mhm.
So, Happy Endings by Margaret Atwood. John and Mary meet. What happens next? If you want a happy ending, try A. And then she has a paragraph A, very typical love story. Everything's great, everything's rosy. We have some kids, we have a life, we have things are great. And at the end, it says, eventually they die. This is the end of the story. And she repeats that trope over and over again. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, this feels like a memento mori of some point. She's like, I don't care what path you choose. You have the happy life, you have a devastating life, you have a life where your house is hit by a flood, your husband leaves you leave your husband, you never loved him in the first place. Any combination of any permutation of people, the only thing I guarantee you is going to happen in this story is that they are going to die. It was the playfulness of Margaret Atwood's, let me tell you about some harsh realities of life, but also in a intriguing way that to me this just is her story. When I read it I was like, this feels like Margaret Atwood because it's matter of fact, it's straightforward, it is a little playful, but it brings up environmentalism, it brings up power dynamics, it brings up ageism, it brings up sexism, it brings up division of labor and all of these things about vanity, about losing your hair and being physically attracted to your partner. It was so many of the things that resonate through her stories that I was like, wow, even in 4 or 5 page story, she's still being completely herself. And I like the fact that she pokes fun at, hey, take your hand to write in this story. If you do not like what I gave you to work with, you can use your imagination and fill in the blanks. But I'm just going to let you know. I know, spoiler alert, everybody dies in the end.
Yeah. I liked her closing statements about I mean, we'll read it, but I wanted to talk about how this is an excellent example of what a postmodernist story is. And I will give the definition in case anyone's like, well, what are you talking about? So, postmodernism in literature is a style of writing that emerged after World War II, around the mid 20th century. And it's known for breaking away from traditional storytelling and challenging the norms of literature. And there are some key features that we can see in this story. And so you mentioned playfulness. So there is definitely she's mixing some different genres like romance and dystopian maybe. There's a lot in there. It's pretty fragmented obviously because we're not getting full stories. We're only getting the beginning and the end and maybe a little bit in the middle, but without a lot of detail. It's of course extremely metafictional. I'll give another definition. I don't want this to be a little stuffy, but why would you know these things unless you are engaging with them? Not you, Jennifer. I mean, just like the royal you. So, metafiction is a story that acknowledges that it's a story. So, characters know they're in a book, for example, or the author can directly speak to the reader, which is happening right now. So, that's the blurring of the lines between fiction and reality. So, of course, Margaret Atwood refers to us in the story, the reader. And then there's irony and parody. And of course, she's parodying stories and romances and the very stereotypical structure of stories and the rejection of good narratives. Let me just read what this says. So, postmodernism often questions big ideas or grand narratives like progress, absolute truth, or universal morals. And instead, it suggests that truth and meaning can be subjective and vary from person to person. So she's not trying to answer a definitive question with a definitive answer. She's saying there are many answers to this question. How will Mary and John, how will their lives turn out? We don't know. There's not a single answer. They're complex and nuanced people or characters, just like in reality. If you're interested in postmodernism and you want to get into that or you just didn't know what it was, this is a great place to start. And you can also try Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, Gravity's Rainbow by the same author, Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. These are hard bugs to read, okay? Or American Psycho is also on this list by Bret Easton Ellis. Hard to read for different reasons because it's pretty gross. That gave us a little bit of a background of what she was actually doing, what she's engaging with in the literary sense.
Yeah, Joey, thank you for putting us in that context so we can understand this story is quirky and it is formulaic on purpose, right? That's
Mhm.
part of its beauty. And I really appreciated you calling attention to some of those other works, which are longer. Obviously, our novels are very complex and interesting reads. I kind of like that this isn't that, right? This is an
Yeah.
easy to digest story. But back to your original point, although I, as a lover of Margaret Atwood, I read The Year of the Flood every single April. So it's coming up, people. Be prepared. It's
Maybe I'll finish the
happening.
trilogy this year. Next month I'll do it.
That would be awesome. I feel particularly attuned to her writing style. It's we have spoken in the past about people like Virginia Woolf or
Mhm.
Kafka or other people who have and George Saunders, very clear literary voices. And so for me her voice was very clear. But to your point, Joey, if this was the very first time I had ever encountered Margaret Atwood, would my super fandom have started here or would I have needed more? And I think for myself, I would have needed more because the evocative nature of her longer works, where she really gets into the human psyche, she really allows you to experience another person's perspective, often putting you in horrific circumstances. You're like, that could never happen. And she's like, oh, by the way, I do a lot of research for my novels, and almost everything I stick in a novel has happened somewhere at some time in the course of human history. So I'm
Mhm.
just not randomly making up far fetched ideas. I'm just harvesting the travesties and the beauty in the world that exist and putting them in a new combination. So, Joey, just thank you for letting me think about the experience of somebody encountering this author for the first time, and that this story, although I love it and I think that you really enjoyed it, it's
Mhm.
not the full picture. It's a little Polaroid snapshot that fell out of her purse. It's not her whole photo album of her entire life and her talents.
I mean, I do love this story. I love what she's doing with it. If you wanted to start with Margaret Atwood and you've never read anything by her, I would read maybe another short story. I don't know enough about her other short stories to be able to suggest one at this moment. But I would start with The Handmaid's Tale, of course, because it's her most well known work. And it's pretty short. I do want to talk about what I gathered from the names. So, John and Mary, those are biblical names, obviously, which I always feel like, why did you do that? They're very common names, obviously, but Madge to me looks like Magdalene, like Mary Magdalene. It feels very intentional, but because we don't get a lot of story here, we don't really know. Did she pick these names because of that, those biblical ties? We don't know. We can, of course, write it. We can decide how and why this story is happening. But to me, that is what I immediately thought of when I saw those names.
And I like the idea, Joey, that you said that there's the biblical part because I was like, well, wait, there's one more extra guy who gets in here. And his name is James. But where the whole narrative falls apart, Joey. In the end, after she goes through her husband, she finds Fred. And Fred just shows up in here. Fred and Madge. They go together in the end. But what I appreciated, yes, these feel very, very generic names. Joey, would you allow me to just briefly ground us in the story of the 6 different scenarios? Can I just do a
Yeah.
quick run through of that? On path A, John and Mary fall in love. They marry, have successful careers, children, and a happy life until they die. Great. Everybody signs up for option A. Option B, Mary loves John, but he's only using her for his own pleasure because he has eyes for someone else. So Mary eventually commits suicide, and John marries the woman he really loved, which was Madge, leading to the same ending as in scenario A. So in storyline C, John, we now find out, is a middle aged man having an affair with a young woman called Mary. Well, that's different. But Mary loves a guy called James, but James is too young to settle down. So John, middle aged man, having an affair, gets mad at Mary and James, kills them, and then kills himself. So we've got this nice murder suicide plot thing going on. Madge then marries Fred, leading to the same ending as A. And scenario D, Fred and Madge now survive a tidal wave and continue their lives until the end of the story A. The second to the last story, Fred dies of a heart condition, and Madge devotes herself to charity work until the ending of A. So everything else stayed the same, but this is how it progressed. And in the final story, John is a revolutionary and Mary is a counter espionage agent. But the story still ends with their deaths, and in the end, questions the meaning of what's a happy ending anyway and who gets to decide. And so I just really appreciated that she builds on the story, she circles back on the story, she makes us reevaluate who in our head John and Mary are. Like if I ask you, Joe, I'm like, well, what do you think John and Mary, like, how old are they? What do they look like? Where did they come from? Where do they live? What do they want to do with their lives? That's so generic. And she starts little by little adding details in to help us flesh that out. And I just really appreciate that in the storytelling mechanism that she was using to draw us in and make us, I don't want to say complicit because that sounds like a weird loaded term, but make us a little more participatory in the storytelling.
Yeah, I do really enjoy that element that we can kind of choose which narrative or which iteration of John and Mary because they will inevitably come together somehow. It might not be mutually beneficial for both of them, but it's an inevitability. Just like death, there was an inevitability that these two would have some type of interaction. And so I like that we can sort of choose to walk away with whichever story resonated with us the most. I do want to talk about and just specifically read option A because again, I feel like Margaret Atwood, did you not think like what if this was the first thing that anyone ever read? It people are not going to be totally stoked on you. Okay, but let me just read it. John and Mary fall in love and get married. They both have worthwhile jobs which they find stimulating and challenging. They buy a charming house. Real estate values go up. Eventually, when they can afford live-in help, they have 2 children to whom they are devoted. The children turn out well. John and Mary have a stimulating and challenging sex life and worthwhile friends. They go on fun vacations together. They retire. They both have hobbies which they find stimulating and challenging. Eventually, they die. This is the end of the story. So we have this really basic story. It's not a plot yet, it's just a story, but she is making us pay attention to be like, why is this it's not a boring story. It's just kind of like, well, I've heard of that. I've heard that. But there's no conflict in the story. And then the very next story, there of course is conflict. And so she's sort of building on, maybe, I don't know that this is how she would write a story, like the process by which she would write a story, but we can see how stories start to develop for an author, where you start with like this very basic thing. You know, John and Mary are going to get together. They're going to have a very, not maybe not simplistic life, but a happy life. They're going to go through the societal norms. They're going to get married, have children, buy a house, go on vacation. I don't know what a stimulating and challenging sex life looks like, I guess, but I hopefully they're getting into each other's fantasies and stuff. That would be nice for them. I hope that for them. And then they retire, they die, and that's it. And so we don't have really anything interesting going on yet. So I really appreciate that she's going through this. As each iteration gets more and more interesting. We're like, oh, like, okay, now I get it. Now this is the story that I want to understand. You know, in the very beginning, it's not really that interesting to be like, okay, and then what happened? And then what happened? And that's definitely an E.M. Forster mentality there.
What came up for me when you were talking about that is that it felt like she was giving us the blueprint of the American dream for a heterosexual couple.
Or
You
a
meet,
Canadian dream.
yes, I was like, I'm just going to make it the American dream
Yeah.
that you fall in love, you get married, you have a job that pays well and is interesting and worthwhile to you, and you buy a house because everybody needs a house, right? That's part of the American narrative of what a successful life looks like.
Mhm.
And of course, the real estate market only goes up in this perfect dream. And then you have enough money to hire
Yeah.
a nanny because God knows nobody wants to raise their own kids. Like, we're definitely going to need some help if we're having our remunerative and worthwhile careers that she talked to us about. And the kids turn out well. They're devoted to each other. I love that she says stimulating and challenging sex life. And then later she says stimulating and challenging hobbies. So I guess when you give up sex in your 80s, you just got to get some hobbies. I just thought that was interesting. But they talk about they have worthwhile friends. They all go on fun vacations together. They retire, they do their hobbies, and then they die. What was interesting for me about that is that really felt like the American dream blueprint. When I was a little girl, this was the story I was told. Like, this is a sure route to happiness. Like, if you check off every one of those boxes, your life is going to be great. Like, there's no way your life's not going to be great. That is the success metric. Like, you're going to get a gold star, 100, 10 out of 10. Great. And thank you for showing us that. And then she's like, you know, the record scratches. She's like, let's start over. None of this ever happens exactly in the right order, and things are always going to get confused. Nobody's on the same page. Here's what else could happen. And I just really appreciated that by setting us up. We know this story. This is just like normal life. This is just what people do in a stereotypical way. And she turns it on its ear. And I just really appreciated that. She's like, wait, he comes over and he has sex with her, but he doesn't take her clothes off because he's not really into it. And like, he comes over every 3 days. They do the same thing every time. He doesn't take her to a restaurant. She finds out that John is having an affair with someone. She's like, I'm not mad about the affair. I'm mad that he took her to a restaurant. Like, he didn't take me to a restaurant. And it was just, in some ways, kind of relatable of the scorned woman and what a person might choose to really get annoyed about. It's like, she didn't really care about John, really. She's like, oh, maybe one day we'll really like each other. But until then, I'm just going to do my duty. And I just thought it was so sweet that Margaret Atwood's like, wow, Mary has her own agenda. She has her own feelings. She has her own perspective. She's making her own trade offs for this relationship. And then we see where that gets her. So, again, that was the feminism coming out, the power dynamics, the power of sex, the power of attraction. All of those things are just under the surface of this story.
Yeah, and I think to go to story B, so the one after the very basic kind of setup, or the American slash Canadian dream. I don't know what Canadians want, but I imagine it's pretty much the same universally that people want this kind of life. Everyone wants to have enough money and to have a nice place to live and be loved and love someone else. But in the next one, the opening line is Mary falls in love with John, but John doesn't fall in love with Mary. And so we immediately get like, oh, there's tension now. There's a problem. There's conflict. We know that they're not in the same space. So what is going to happen? And I think to go back to her idea of us trying to supply the how and why, she makes us more interested to want to supply that information. Why does John not love Mary? How did they meet? Why does Mary go from trying to seduce John as best as she can to suicide? That scene says Mary collects all the sleeping pills and aspirins she can find and takes them and a half a bottle of sherry. You can see what kind of woman she is by the fact that it's not even whiskey. She leaves a note for John. She hoped he'll discover her and get her to the hospital in time and repent, and then they can get married. But this fails to happen, and she dies. John marries Madge, and everything continues as an A. Okay, so we want to know, like, well, how did this happen? This seems like a drastic step. We don't know how long they've been together. There's so much information that she obviously, like I said, purposely leaves out. That was always the intent. But it starts to tickle our own creative juices as the reader to be like, well, she's not going to give it to me. So I need to know why this is happening. I need to know why John is acting like this. Is this just his personality? He runs through women. Is Mary habitually codependent and needs a partner to validate her or stuff like that? You just want to supply everything. And I really, really love that. And then, as we said, she continues, we get new characters. So I really love the way that she's building out this story. If she does not use this as her way of figuring out a story, it feels like a good way to do it if she doesn't.
Joey, I love that you say that because it takes me back to conversations we've had in the past about something George Saunders often says, is it a story yet?
Mhm.
Right? And in each of these things, it's like, okay, in the first one, is that really a story? I mean, you did tell me what happens. Like, they go through their life cycle and then they die. I guess that's a story, but it's not a very interesting story. And then the next version of the story has complications. And those complications make you go, ooh, I'm invested now. I'm interested. All the things that you just came up with, you're like, what's Mary's backstory? What was her background? Is she emotionally stable? Why doesn't she have any whiskey in her house and she only has sherry? Like all of those things that Margaret Atwood sprinkles in for us. What on earth, girl, did you think that this guy who only comes around every 3 days is going to find you in time to get you to the hospital? I am so sorry. I am not putting someone else in charge of my suicide. I think that needs to be a self-service thing because this guy is unreliable and we see how that ended. In each of these progressive storylines, you could keep saying, is it a story yet? Oh, wait, is this the story? Is this the story? So, as you said, what a great exercise and playfulness for those of us who enjoy writing stories or telling stories to try to understand what makes a story interesting. Why do we even care about these people? I think in version A, if I'm being brutally honest, I'm like, oh, good for you guys. Right? Little apple pie family with their 2.2 kids and their dog and their white picket fence. Oh, good for you. So boring. And then it gets a little spicier. And then it gets a little spicier. And I think the complications are what make life interesting. And I'll just leave it at this, Joy. I think the people that I know who have experienced big challenges, big loves, big moves, big everything, do have these amazingly beautiful stories to tell. But I was speaking to someone the other day about his parents who have been married 55 years. They were high school sweethearts. They're still together. And for me, it's just like, whoa, like that seems like a very straightforward story. But if you scratch the surface, it may have more to it than meets the eye. So I just thought it was really great that she's giving us traditional storylines and then shaking them up.
Yeah, I think my favorite part of this story is probably option C, where John is the older man and Mary is 22 and she's sort of like, I don't know. You can you can perform for longer than these younger guys that I'm with. You're more experienced. So like I like that about you, but I don't care about the rest of it. And so we have this role reversal of now Mary is using John and is engaging in a transactional relationship that is one-sided, and we have an imbalanced dynamic here because as far as I can tell there's no communication between either person in either storyline setting that up and communicating that as adults do.
Joey, you just reminded me of a very important plot point in version C. John is married to someone
Mhm.
else. And so I was just like, wait a minute, sir. How do you think this is going to end up? And I do appreciate that Mary's like, I'm just kind of, he's a placeholder. Like, I enjoy having a sexual relationship with this older man, but I'm really in love with somebody else who's just not old enough or responsible enough. So it's a placeholder. I'm going to just bide my time. And eventually, my guy James is going to get himself together and someday turn into an older gentleman. And I'll be so done with John because his wife is probably going to find out. But then, classic, Dateline NBC investigative report.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's enjoying James's sexual company as well. John, because he's like the dude who has the money. He comes in with the key that she gave him, finds them. I can't say that word that when you get caught in the middle of lovemaking, there's a special like Italian word for that. There's a very fancy phrase for kind of getting caught in the act. And they got caught in the act. John is like, I don't think so. So he murders Mary and James in bed and then kills himself. And poor Madge. So it's like, wow, big reveal here. My husband was having an affair and he's also a psychotic murderer. Great. But that leaves me open to Fred, who's lovely. And so life goes on, but not for them because they're
Yeah.
already dead.
Then she gets to have a very normal plot line, storyline with Fred. So good
Normal
for
ish.
her. Yeah.
Normal
Well,
ish.
she goes to A with Fred. So other than her trauma that she now has to take with her, she has a pretty good life with Fred, I have to say. But yeah, I really like this story because again, we're getting more information. There's starting to be there's not really plot, but there's more conflict here, and we get sort of a surprise ending, which to be fair, is not super surprising. This is not the first time someone has told the story. It's not the first time it's happened in real life where jilted lover comes and kills his lover and her lover and then himself. And it reminds me of Jazz by Toni Morrison. That's just one book that I have read recently. That's not exactly how it happens, but he does kill his lover, which is not a spoiler. It happens in the very beginning of the story. It's important information for you to start the story. So if anyone wants to read it, you still should because that's not how it works in Jazz. Yeah, I think it's introducing different elements of making the story more complicated because John's obviously married to Madge and Mary has her heart set on James, who is sort of like the bad boy, which, like, girl, I get it. We all like a bad boy. I was just saying that to my dog the other day.
I think that's the best person to confess that to, Joey,
Oh,
actually,
I say it all the
as
time.
I know it.
Yeah, I don't care. I mean, I should care, but yeah, so I think that's probably my favorite one. It doesn't get as complicated after that. I think that's probably the most conflict in that one. But she makes a good point at the end of this story of happy endings. She says the only authentic ending is the one provided here. John and Mary die, John and Mary die, John and Mary die. And I like what she's starting to comment on right after. She says, so much for endings. Beginnings are always more fun. True connoisseurs, however, are known to favor the stretch in between since it's the hardest to do anything with. Again, there's this inevitability that John and Mary will always die in the end. I mean, not all stories end in a death or have a death in them. They can end on a happy note. Eventually, we know those characters would have to die unless you're reading a fantasy story and it's about like immortal beings or something, but one grounded in reality. I like that she's talking about it just like in reality that all of our beginnings are very different and what happens in between our birth and our death is varied. It's always going to be different from the other person that we know. And I think that's what makes engaging stories. We know that there's like an inevitability to endings, but how the author decides to start us off and at what point and what are all the fun stuff that happens in between. Everyone should try to write the how and why. I don't want to do it for this, but everyone should.
Joey, I appreciate that because I read something today by Laura Dern, who wrote a letter to her teenage daughter, and I cannot quote it for you here,
Wait, is
but the
She's from Jurassic, she was in Jurassic Park, right?
yeah, famous actress,
Okay,
Laura
okay.
Dern. Yeah. She was writing a letter to her teenage daughter talking about life and social media and all sorts of interesting things. But basically, she said, most of your life is going to be between ecstasy and heartbreak. Most of your life happens in this big gray stretch that's neither heartbreak or ecstasy. And that's where the good stuff is, right? That is where the good stuff is. And so, Joey, when you said we all have a beginning story, we all end up dead, but there is this stretch of time for most of us, a long stretch of time, where all of our storylines get created, get reshuffled, get intertwined with others. And I just thought that was just really beautiful to remind ourselves that yes, there are moments of heartbreak. Yes, there are moments of pure joy and beauty and love. But you're probably going to spend a lot of time in that middle zone of both of those things at once. And I just really thought that was great advice. And I want to end my comments here on this story by just reading the first paragraphs of episode F, right? Plotline F, because it's Margaret Atwood calling us out. Like she's punking us a tiny little bit. And I really appreciate that her humor to me just comes through. So, story F. If you think this is all too bourgeoisie, make John a revolutionary and Mary a counter espionage agent and see how far that gets you. Remember, this is Canada. You'll still end up with A, though in between you may get a lustful, brawling saga of passionate involvement, a chronicle of our times. Sort of. You'll have to face it. The endings are the same, however you slice it. Don't be deluded by any other endings. They're all fake. Either deliberately fake, with malicious intent to deceive, or just motivated by excessive optimism, if not by downright sentimentality. And so I just love that she is like, you can tell yourself, you, the big you, can tell yourself any version of the story, but just know there's some realities here. And you can lie about it, you can be overly optimistic, but face the facts. We're all going down at one point, and it's just a matter of what we do between the starting and the ending gun, right? We just have to run the race the way we're going to do it, and there's no telling how that's going to go. After she, I don't want to say makes fun of us, but says, hey, I'm telling you a story. If you don't like the story, go write your own, because the end said, now try how and why. For me, that's also this philosophical moment where she's like, do you want to examine how you choose to live your life? Do you want to examine why you do the things you do? I know for me that is based on knowing her other work. She's always asking us to make moral decisions. She's always asking us to watch other people's behavior and the consequences of those. So for me, it's a very loaded statement of, okay, we get your start, we get your end. We all agree that's going to happen. You decide the how and the why of your life and the lives of these characters. And I was like, thank you for making me part of the storytelling process, Margaret Atwood. I really appreciate co-writing this in my brain with you.
Bravo. Yeah.
The end. Thank you for listening to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And don't worry, it'll be our little secret if you stepped out of your literary comfort zone. Looking for more ways to connect with us? Check out our link tree to follow us on TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky, and Storygraph. And for the really lit curious, check out our website at extraliteraryAffairs.com.